Thank you. I think there's no doubt that the Nuclear Security Summit process has been and is a very important driving force with regard to the strengthening of the current nuclear regime, which so obviously needs strengthening. The high-level political attention by a large number of heads of state or governments, both in Washington 2010 and in Seoul 2012, clearly has raised the profile of the issue and the recognition of what should be done in order to defend the world against nuclear terrorism. But the value of the Nuclear Security Summit process is not only of a political and inspirational character. It has also led to a large number of commitments by states participating in the summits, inter alia through the so-called house gifts or gift baskets. Tangible and practical results have been achieved as a result. For example, national laws and regulations have been updated, export control systems have been improved, and physical protection of facilities with nuclear and other radioactive materials has been strengthened. Likewise, states have committed themselves to increase cooperation in matters like minimization of the use of highly enriched uranium, transport security, and prevention of nuclear smuggling. And a number of states have pledged additional funding for the IAEA Nuclear Security Fund, which absolutely needs more funding. The agenda has also been expanded. While the Washington summit endorsed the efforts to secure all vulnerable nuclear material, the Seoul summit widened the scope by including radiological source security. Much more can and ought to be said about the impact and the results of the two first summits and the expectations and hopes for the third summit, I don't say the last, but the third summit in The Hague next year. Luckily, we can hear much more about that from the horse's own mouth, so to say, as we are so privileged to have the Sherpas of the three summit host countries with us here at this session. And the three gentlemen are probably known to many of you and their past as well, but starting not historically, but by seating, Ambassador Piet de Klerk is still, but not for very long, I think, Ambassador of the Netherlands in Jordan, and at the same time, Sherpa of Nuclear Security Summit 2014 in The Hague. Among the many posts Ambassador de Klerk has had, I should mention that he was Deputy Permanent Representative of the Netherlands at the United Nations in New York. He has a career in the IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Agency in Vienna, as Director of External Relations and Policy Coordination, and has also been on the other side of the table in Vienna as Deputy Resident Representative to the organization. The next Sherpa I would like to present briefly is Dr. Kim Bong-hyun, who is Deputy Minister for Multilateral and Global Affairs in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade in Korea. He has been Director General of the Overseas Koreans and Consular Affairs Bureau, Ambassador of the Korean Permanent Mission to the United Nations in New York, and Director in the United Nations for the division at MOFAT. and not to forget the Sherpa for Korea at the summit 2012. And Dr. Gary Seymour has very recently left his job as Sherpa for the US for the 2 summits so far, for Washington and for Seoul, and has now become Executive Director at the Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs at Harvard University. Among his former positions, as I mentioned, he served for 4 years as President Obama's White House Coordinator for Arms Control and Weapons of Mass Destruction, and this included the task as US Sherpa for the 2 summits so far. And he has been Vice President for Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations and has had several other academic and governmental positions. About myself, I should just mention that I have been a long time in the Danish diplomatic service. My latest posting was in Vienna, 6.5 years, credited to inter alia, the IAA. So I think we all have a good, solid IAA and UN background. In this first round, I suggest that our panelists give us their assessment of the significance and achievements of the first 2 summits and the expectations for the third one, not only about what has been achieved, but also what has not been achieved, where the summits have been less successful, and maybe also some ideas of what could be done about that. And of course, we would also like to hear your expectations and hopes for the third summit in The Hague. So in historical order, I would like to give the floor first to Gary Seymour.
Thank you, Ambassador. Well, now that I'm outside government, I'm in the position of giving free advice to my friends in the government, even if they don't need it. So with that in mind, let me give 4 pieces of advice to my friends. First, keep it simple. In Washington, the Sherpas produced a very short communique with general political principles, along with a more detailed work plan that was produced by the experts. In Seoul, we very deliberately tried a different approach of combining the broad principles with a more detailed work plan, and that produced a much longer communique with many more technical details. And as my colleague, Ambassador Kim, knows, this took a tremendous amount of effort. I think in part because sometimes when we were discussing technical issues, many of the Sherpas, including myself, didn't really have enough knowledge and experience to know what they were talking about. And so I often thought we were negotiating over words without fully appreciating what those words meant. So in hindsight, I think the first model was actually a better use of the Sherpa's time. So I would aim for a very short, general communique and leave all the technical details to the experts. In fact, I think the great value of the summit process is that it's created a political umbrella, a diplomatic umbrella, for the real security experts and practitioners, including police and people that have on-the-ground responsibility for the security of nuclear materials and facilities, to meet and talk to each other. And our objective should be to keep the diplomats out of the way and let the people that actually have responsibility work together. My second piece of advice is keep it focused. One reason why the summits have been successful is that we've really focused our attention on the very specific issue of reducing the threat of nuclear terrorism by strengthening security of nuclear materials, which means removing, eliminating, consolidating as much as possible highly enriched uranium and separated plutonium, and then ensuring that any sites that retain that fissile material meet high standards for physical security and accounting. In order to keep the summit focused on nuclear security, we've had to fight off efforts by some of the participants who wanted to add to the agenda issues related to nuclear disarmament and nonproliferation and nuclear energy. And as my colleague Ambassador Kim knows, again, it took a tremendous amount of energy for us to unsuccessfully try to negotiate a single additional sentence to the Seoul communique that dealt with nuclear disarmament. And at the end of the day, it proved impossible to get agreement on a single sentence. So we just went back to the formulation that was in the Washington communique. And I think, this reflects the diversity of countries that attend the Nuclear Security Summit, both nuclear weapon states and non-nuclear weapon states, non-aligned countries, advanced countries, industrial countries, plus a range of regional groups. And I think the communiques, the summits will be much more effective if it's limited in scope to the specific issue of nuclear security, about which there's little controversy, and we keep these other issues about which there's tremendous controversy, like disarmament and nonproliferation, keep them where they belong in the UN First Committee and the Conference on Disarmament and the NPT review process. My third piece of advice is keep it practical. As I said, the summits have been successful in producing practical steps and commitments to practical steps by individual countries and groups of countries to strengthen nuclear security. The Seoul summit harvested many of the commitments, most of the commitments made in Washington, and I have no doubt that the Hague summit will harvest many of the commitments made in Seoul. This practical approach accepts that nuclear security is ultimately the sovereign responsibility of individual countries, including voluntary decisions whether to join some of the instruments of the regime, like the Convention on the Physical Protection of Nuclear Material. I don't think it's practical to try to negotiate a new global regime that would set standards for nuclear security and then set up a mechanism for countries to submit to international inspection or monitoring to verify that they're fulfilling those obligations. I think that kind of a system is very desirable in theory, but in practice I just don't think it's achievable, and I think it would distract attention from convincing governments to take practical measures. And those practical measures might include a group of countries being willing to go beyond the existing mechanisms and share information about their national practices and cooperate on nuclear security in ways that can provide greater assurance about the steps they're taking. And that might be a way to get at questions concerning the security of nuclear materials that are in military programs. For example, if there's greater cooperation among countries that have such military programs. My fourth piece of advice, my final piece of advice, is keep it going. We all recognize that the nuclear security process was never intended to be a permanent institution, and that sooner or later we would need to declare victory and hand over the work of the summits to existing institutions like the IAEA and the UN. The only question is when and how. One option people have talked about is ending the process in 2014 in The Hague, which would mark the end of the 4-year period that the leaders committed to in Washington. On balance, however, I'm personally attracted to the idea of having one more summit in 2016, maybe in Washington, which would be the last summit President Obama could preside over, since that's the end of his presidency. And that would give us 4 more years to consolidate the work that we began in Washington in 2010 and to cash in on additional commitments that will be made at the Hague Summit. So to summarize, I have 4 pieces of advice. Keep it simple, keep it focused, keep it practical, and keep it going.
Thank you very much. And Ambassador Kim, you are next.
Thank you, John. I had the privilege of serving as a Sherpa of the hosting country, the Republic of Korea, for the second Nuclear Security Summit in 2012. Already it has been 1 year since the second Security Summit was over. I worked very closely with Gary, and we owed a lot to him for the success of the second Nuclear Security Summit. In that sense, I'm very grateful to the assistance and the advice from his expertise and the friendly advice. And also the Piet, he's also my long-time friend from in New York. We served together when I worked at the Korean mission to the United Nations. He's a real expert in this field, so I think he's the right person as a Sherpa of the hosting country for the next Security Summit. As the Sherpa of the second Nuclear Security Summit in 2012, during the process of the preparation for the summit, we thought that, and we were wondering how it could be possible to lock down all the nuclear materials in the world. We had information that probably in this world we have more than 600 tons of highly enriched uranium and 500 tons of plutonium. It is a huge amount of the nuclear material. How we can lock down this formidable number of the nuclear material. It is the same, probably the question and the challenge also will be felt by Piet, how we could make this, all the materials locked down. But if we think about the character of this the amount of the nuclear material, the highly enriched uranium and plutonium, we can know that probably the most amount of this nuclear material exists in the type of nuclear weapons. It means that probably P5, the US and Russia and other the nuclear weapons states, they hold almost all, probably the most of the amount of the nuclear material. Therefore, we can focus, as Gary said, that we make some focus on this issue. For example, if we make a focus on the civilian use of nuclear material, then we can think that it could be possible to lock down the civilian use nuclear material, other than the weapons, the nuclear materials. Therefore, in the second Nuclear Security Summit in Seoul, we focused more on civilian use. As Gary said, that there was some controversy in the participating countries, especially from the non-aligned movement countries. They challenged us that they also should include the kind of the non-proliferation issue as well in this summit. But we need to focus more on civilian use of nuclear material. Otherwise, we cannot lock down the nuclear material, the vision suggested by the President Obama. In the civilian use of nuclear materials, mostly the European countries and the United States and Canada, Australia, those advanced countries hold this civilian use of nuclear materials. Therefore, the fundamental problem is that how we can get some cooperation, more active cooperation from those advanced countries. That is the challenge to us. And also, after the summit, I felt that we need more cooperation from the advanced countries. And during the process of the debate and discussions among the participating countries, many the non-alignment movement countries like India, Pakistan, and the South Africa, and Brazil, and many so-called developing countries, they felt that some kind of discrimination against European countries, because European countries, they hold the major part of nuclear materials, but they don't do enough the contribution to this nuclear security. Therefore, there was the very hot debate on the role of the advanced countries and the developing countries. Still, probably in the third summit, for the new the communique, probably the developing countries, they will raise the same question and problem to the advanced countries and to the hosting countries as well. And in the second summit, probably in the first summit, because that was the first summit in Washington, D.C., the U.S. president tried to set up the kind of the political declaration for the nuclear security. But in the second summit in Seoul, we tried to suggest and offer more practical the declaration rather than political, because the political vision was set up by President Obama in the first security summit. Therefore, in the second summit, my president, Lee Myung-bak, he offered rather practical vision. Therefore, we achieved a lot of commitment from the countries. Like we achieved the 53 countries commitment, 100 commitments from 53 countries. And also, the very significance of the second summit is that in terms of the lockdown of civilian news, we tried to make a scientific approach and more technical the approach. We therefore form the 4 countries joint project for using the low enriched uranium rather than highly enriched uranium for producing medical isotope like that. That is, I think, is a very meaningful the attempt of 4 countries. And if this project turn out to be a success, then probably it could be a breakthrough in making the lockdown of the civilian use of highly enriched uranium. And also we had a lot of many countries participating in the ratification of the international nuclear security the regime. And we set up the target date for bringing into effect of the CPPNM by 2014. That was quite a very difficult negotiation among the participating countries, but finally we got that very the practical the target of the bringing into effect of the CPPNM by 2014, and also the voluntary minimization of highly enriched uranium by 2013. Those 2 things are the very practical the achievement in the second nuclear security summit. But I'd like to give some advice for the next summit. Probably, Piotr, you will face a very the daunting challenge from the non-aligned movement countries. Therefore, I hope you could conduct a more active the outreach to the developing countries. The summit process should be inclusive. Otherwise, the summit process cannot be supported by the majority of the member states of the United Nations. The UN member states, they were a little bit frustrated by the only very selective some countries are participating in the nuclear security summit, but the majority of the countries are isolated. Therefore, they feel some frustration. Therefore, we can we can give more opportunity for them to be part of this summit process, not in the summit itself, but in the process of the preparation. We can give a more chance for them to be involved in this summit process. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And now to the challenges which are awaiting Pete and many of us. You have the floor.
Thank you, John, and thank you, Gary and Bong, for these introductions, in a sense, and putting these responsibilities on our shoulders. It will be difficult to follow in your footsteps because both summits were extremely well organized, and that's in itself a challenge already, but also much of the low-hanging fruit of this process of presidents and prime ministers spurring on their practitioners. Much of that low-hanging fruit has already been picked, and the question is how much more can be achieved in The Hague. Now, needless to say, this is a responsibility, a heavy responsibility as well, because the subject matter is so important. You referred to the huge quantities of nuclear weapon usable material, and the large part of that material that is military. And I think it's also important that the emphasis has been put by President Obama in the first place on nuclear security in the last few years and on physical protection. And I don't need to underline the seriousness of this area, but for me it's a sort of a combination of 9/11 and terrorist intentions and the practical skills that were demonstrated by different networks distributing nuclear capabilities to different countries, including the neighboring country here in Seoul. Now, our summit in The Hague will be held in March 2014, 24 and 25th, and we have a year to go, and that's not much time. Moreover, it will not only be the summit itself, but like in Korea, we also plan to have an industrial summit and an academic summit, although both of these other summits are a bit figuratively speaking. But nevertheless, we attach great importance to them because in our mind, it's not only governments that are the stakeholders, it's also industry, it's also think tanks. And we attach great importance to the other meetings as well, and we try to make them more into a part of the process instead of only an event in the days before the actual summit. The preparatory process has started late last year, and we will continue after the summer, and then we will put pen on paper, and I've taken note of Gary's advice of keeping it simple, and I think that's very, very wise, but such decisions on that will be only taken in a couple of months. Now, as to the substance, first of all, there's the important substance, it was referred to already, of reducing, eliminating, concentrating weapons usable material. There's a bit of an asymmetry there between high enriched uranium, which you can transform into low enriched on the one hand and plutonium on the other, but it's clear that that process needs to continue, and it's also clear that the United States and Russia have as the countries of origin where much of that material came from, have a large role. And then we talk primarily about civil material, was referred to already. But as 3/4 of all nuclear material, weapons usable material is military, something needs to be done with that as well, and that will not be easy because, of course, you can't negotiate in a 50+ forum about such commitments, but maybe there's a role for the P5 to commit that at least the standards for civil nuclear material would also be adhered to for military material, not necessarily material in nuclear weapons. More material actually is not in weapons, but is somewhere stored or is in different forms and shapes. And the multilateral guidelines we have, for example, in the context of the IEA, that we have, provide some linkages to that. Because, for example, the famous IEA guidelines, Instruct 225, say this is about material for peaceful purposes, but if states want to adhere to these guidelines for other material, they should by all means do so. So that is one area where we think progress is possible. And the second area is the legal regime. And indeed, this Convention on the Physical Protection of Nuclear Material was already mentioned. It would be a key result if we manage to get that into force. Quite a number of countries are not yet parties to that. We know it's a long process, it involves parliaments, etc., but it's really key, especially for a large number of countries in Asia, to become party. We have more than 30 countries to go before this amended convention enters into force, and that's key because it then not only gives norms for international transport, but also for all transports and for all material in use and in storage. That will be maybe a modest step, but a key step, and whether we come to this new international agreement, I think it's not realistic to think that can be done in a year. Moreover, in an organization that has no permanent base, that only meets a number of times, and really, I come back to that when we talk about the future. The third area that I want to mention is the actual operational security measures. And it's clear that you don't want, as a government, you have a responsibility that the nuclear material in your country is well protected. But you don't want others to know too much about these operational measures. You want to keep them secret. So how, it's a sort of a methodological conundrum. How can you give assurances that your system works well without giving away what the system is precisely? And that's this difficult area of how can you provide assurances to the outside world that your system works well, and that you can provide these assurances to other countries, to the outside world, because by such assurances, the system as a whole would generate more confidence that the different countries involved have secured their nuclear material. So these are three areas, a number of other areas that I won't say much, maybe we can do that later. I fully agree with Gary that we should focus on nuclear material, but nevertheless I think as a sort of a secondary area, I think that it's good to try to improve protection of radiological sources, simply because they can do damage as well in a very different way, dirty bombs and all that. So that should not be neglected. And then there are a few process steps as well, like better interaction between government and industry, because in industry that's where most of the practical protection work needs to be done. Maybe a last word about the future very briefly, because maybe we can talk about it more at length in a later round, but I think there are strong arguments for making The Hague the last summit. We have not taken any decision about that, but at some point, and I think, as Gary said, at some point you need to have this process, which is non-inclusive, which consists of 53 countries, to flow into regular multilateral channels, because there you have the permanent secretariat, the expertise, the skills, etc., and then you can have new instruments. You can debate, of course, whether that transfer needs to be done in 2014. There are a number of yardsticks, like this nuclear security conference in July in Vienna. But I think that both the argument that this is a non-inclusive process and that after 3 summits, the presence and the pressure of heads of state and government has squeezed the lemon enough that further summits would have a declining value in our view. But that's, as I said, a discussion we need to continue in the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Pete. Among the advice which was given to you was also, as mentioned by Bong Hyun, to try to make the process or the meeting in The Hague more inclusive, in the sense that a majority of the UN member states are not taking part in these summit meetings. Could you imagine that the summit in The Hague could list a number of basic principles for strengthening of nuclear security, which also non-participating states were invited to adhere to, as a way of making the process and the achievements more inclusive?
Yes, as a matter of fact, many of what we project as the outcome are principles that could apply or could be applied by a wide range of states. Of course, the composition of the NSS as it is now is that by far most states that have this nuclear material, nuclear weapons usable material on their territory are party to, are participating in the NSS, and the two exceptions are all known to you. So many of the principles and measures we agree on having to do specifically with nuclear material do not apply to others because they simply don't have that material. But by and large, the more general principles of how to behave in this area could be applied. So that's one part of the answer. The other part of the answer is that we fully realize that it's a non-inclusive process, and we plan an active outreach to other countries to make them aware of what is going on and inform them and try to take away possible distrust. But we have no plans to expand the group because it's a large group as it is, and it's difficult enough to come to agreement at 53 given the large differences that there are among ourselves.
Yeah. One of the most difficult questions you have to solve in The Hague, I think, is what is going to happen after The Hague. And I guess everybody agrees that these results and this attention which the summit process has brought about has somehow to be followed up. Gary has already touched upon it, but which options do you see for a follow-up of the summit process if The Hague is the last one? And of course, the summit process could also be continued with larger intervals. That might be one of the options. But what else? Which other possibilities? And what are the pros and cons in these other options? Pete, would you start?
Yeah, thanks. I think first and foremost, we think of the IAEA as the organization that has the expertise, that has the willingness, and that to do more, and that the organization that already does quite a lot in this area. It is really the backbone of the multilateral system in this area. Of course, resources are always an issue. The attention for and the resources for nuclear security have expanded over the last 4 years, and Director General Amano has said that nuclear security will be one of his few priorities, and that he wants to allocate more resources to it. So he has made all the right noises. Of course, you can debate the pros and cons of any multilateral organization. It's clear that we then come in a bigger arena, and progress will be more difficult. So you need to weigh that. But definitely, the IAEA is one important part of the of what comes after the summits, whether it's The Hague or a further summit. Part of it can be also taken over by the UN itself, if you think of the legal regime that is partly developed in New York, so that's also a component of a follow-up regime. And the third area, I would say, is a number of ad hoc bodies that have originated from the G8, G20 context that do useful work and that already now have a certain overlap with the work of the NSS. I think, for example, nuclear forensics. My country is very active in that, but both in the context of the NSS and in one of the other G20, G8 configurations. And then there's, of course, as a last component, anything that flows from the NSS summits. Gary mentioned a sort of a lead group that would cooperate more intensively in the future, and it could continue, but not, I think, in the form of such a large group of heads of state and government.
Of course, the IAEA has to play a major part has to continue to play a major part in what happens, because after all, the technical expertise and experience is very much based in Vienna. But many people ask the question, what about this political attention and impetus at high level? Is that going to disappear if the work goes exclusively to the IAEA? Gary, you have a point on that?
Well, you know, I think it's a good question, and we'll get some test of whether or not the IAEA can carry the ball when this year in July, the IAEA will host a ministerial level meeting to talk about nuclear security, and I think it will be instructive whether the meeting can be productive and can produce not only words but also some real actions. And I agree with Pete that the IAEA in any event will be one of the chief institutions that will carry on the work of the Nuclear Security Summit, not only because it's inclusive, but also because the IAEA, we all want the IAEA to be very active in terms of providing advice and assistance and training to countries that are interested in nuclear security. And of course, the IAEA has a mechanism for doing that. I do think resources will be an important issue. Right now, the nuclear security work carried on by the IAEA is almost completely funded by voluntary contributions. So if we are to expect the IAEA to pick up from the work of the Nuclear Security Summit, we also have an obligation to make sure that it has adequate funding. And given, well, I mean, you know, Ambassador Betty, better than any of us, the battles that go on in Vienna over the budget, I'm not sure we're going to squeeze any nuclear security summit money out of the regular budget. So I would love to see some funding mechanism set up by countries that are interested in nuclear security and who have the, you know, resources they can commit, so that the agency has a multi-year funding for their nuclear security work, and they don't have to go around with a tin cup every year, you know, begging for financial support so they can do the work we expect them to do.
Yeah, yeah. The funding is a big problem because it's uncertain how much money the Nuclear Security Office has for the next year. There's some talk, or has been for a long time, I think, about making a compromise between the two areas which are funded outside the regular budget, namely technical cooperation and nuclear security. But even if it looks like a logical compromise, it's not so easy in practice. And about the future, Jong-hun?
Well, after the third summit, the Netherlands summit, what would happen? We have to see what we can achieve in the third summit. In the first, the Sherpa meeting for the Netherlands summit, I I suggested the compromise idea for the plan beyond 2014, that we have to see what we could achieve in the third summit first. And then if we are not satisfied with the result of the third summit, then we should continue our process. If we downgrade the summit process to the ministerial level process, then probably we could lose the political impetus. As you, John, you mentioned that political impetus is a very important element in the summit process. Therefore, if we lose the high level, the political impetus, then we could not achieve this daunting the issue of nuclear security. Therefore, we need to continue our political impetus. But if we are satisfied with the result of the third summit, then we could downgrade the summit process to the ministerial level. This year in July in IAEA will host the ministerial level the conference. Therefore, the 2014 Nuclear Security Summit could bring about the satisfactory result, and we could downgrade our process to the. My guess is that probably in the third summit we cannot be satisfied with the result of the third summit because we have still a huge amount of nuclear material which should be locked down. But and also we have to see how this the scientific and the technological breakthrough could be made in 2014 and 16. As I mentioned, we have 2 joint projects by some countries, including Republic of Korea, for the medical isotope production. That is the fundamentally important issue in the civilian use. The civilian use, the research reactor and civilian use reactor, basically they are producing medical isotope by highly enriched uranium, HEU. Then if we can replace HEU by LEU technologically, then we could make some the breakthrough. Therefore, we have to see what would happen until 2014. Then we could decide whether we could continue our the summit process or not. But one compromise is that 2013, this year we will have the ministerial level by IAEA. Then this could be a 3-year term, the conference. Then 2016 also we will have a ministerial level hosted by IAEA. Therefore, 2016 we will have a ministerial level by IAEA, and 2014 and 2016, and then 2019 again we will have the 3rd ministerial level conference by IAEA. Then 2013 and 2019, if we can make this 2019 conference to the summit level conference, then we can continue our political impetus. That is my compromise idea, which was suggested in the first Sherpa meeting for the Netherlands summit. And I'd like to add one more, the aspect of the nuclear security summit. In the second summit in Seoul, we expanded the scope of the agenda of the summit. The United States was not cooperative in expanding our agenda to the radiological sources protection. As Pete mentioned, that this radiological the sources protection is very, very important, and also the possible the transfer of nuclear materials from the state actors to non-state actors. That is also very important. For example, the North Korea's nuclear material, the highly enriched uranium, possibly be transferred to the non-state actor like Al-Qaeda, then what would happen to the world? That is also the fundamentally important challenge to us. Therefore, in the third summit also, we have to think about that, the agenda for the possible protection of the nuclear.
Yes.
It's a failed state like DPRK and Iran, if they transfer the nuclear material to the non-state actors, then it could be a disaster to the world.
Both Gary and Pete have comments. Gary?
You know, one shocking idea would be let the leaders discuss themselves in The Hague whether or not they think the summit process has run its course or whether they think the meetings are useful enough for them to continue. I mean, I remember in Seoul at the end of the meeting, President Obama said, you know, that he thanked all the leaders for making time to come because there are lots of summits, right? I mean, all the leaders have to go to many summits and a lot of work goes into them. And we all know the summits have been very effective in producing concrete results. I think the question will be whether or not, as Pete said, whether or not there's additional practical results to be achieved and whether the leaders think that this is a useful way for them to spend their time. Of course, as in any summit, a lot of business gets done on the margins that has nothing to do with nuclear security. So whenever you get the leaders together, there's actually some there's some additive value above and beyond whatever happens to be on the agenda.
Right. Pete?
I agree with much of what Byung and Gary have said, but I'd like to stress that whether it's now or in 2014 or 2016 or 2019, there will still be huge quantities of nuclear material. And the only question is, have we made enough progress by this formula of having heads of state and government so closely in touch with this area to say this is as far as we can get by this method and we should now go to other forms. So to me the question is a question of added value, and I'm attracted to what Gary says, that the leaders should discuss this question themselves. But at the same time, we are also faced with the other side of the coin, that if you keep it open till the summit itself and don't make a decision, say, in the fall, or a decision in principle, because ultimately, of course, heads of state and government can discuss whatever they want. But if you make a decision in principle, say, in October, then your way of preparing for the actual summit becomes very different. When you know it's the last one, than when you know there's one or more summits after that, because then it's another interim stage. And when you know it's the last one, then you need to finish the process, and there's more pressure on the process to come to concrete results.
Yeah, and of course there's the political problem also, that a summit with, after all, a limited number of states participating, can they just politically send the whole issue on to the IAEA? How will that be received? But of course the IAEA has the advantage of being universal, and as Bong Hyun said, on the plate of the IAEA there is, together with the 2014 summit, there is a number of meetings there which could be elevated to a higher level. The hope is, of course, that it will be already this summer a high number of participants at ministerial level, and especially many foreign ministers would be very fortunate. At the general conferences in the IAEA, there are rather few ministers, and if there are, it's very often ministers for energy. And then, as you mentioned also, Bong Hyun, why could the IAEA not have a summit meeting from time to time? These meetings with 3 years interval, they would normally be ministerial meetings, but there's no law against having a summit within the framework of the IAEA, as you have in the UN, as we have in NATO, as we have every second week in EU. It's possible to have a summit, say, every 3 years, at least call a summit level meeting in the IAEA, if that is seen as helpful. It's 6 o'clock, so I'm told that it's exactly, the sign is up, which means that it's time for questions from the audience. Ken?
fair to say that I think we would all agree that the summits have produced an awful lot of good work and good concrete results. The question is it sustainable? Because the problem is a long-term problem. It's a solvable problem, but it's a long-term problem. And can you solve it over the long term, let's be practical, through a series of voluntary measures with only some states? Or what do you need to do to be sustainable over the coming decades, well beyond 2020, to ensure that not just states that have material, but also states through which material may transit on its way to its ultimate use, feel engagement, feel obligations, and take action. So I would just encourage Ambassador de Klerk, as he looks forward for 2014, to think, what is it that can come out of 2014 that can help make this process truly sustainable? Because the consequence, I mean, we need to have an approach that matches the prevention efforts with the consequences of terrorism. And I think we can all be confident that if there is an act of nuclear terrorism, the approach to nuclear security is going to be, what will be considered practicable will be much different than what we consider today. But I think we know what we could do today to really stop terrorism. So why don't we do it ahead of time before the event? So no question there, but just a comment and an encouragement to look ahead and see how can you be sustainable.
Thank you. Over here.
Gareth.
Need a micro here.
Gareth Evans from Australia. Am I wrong in discerning, and Gary Seymour's contribution in particular, just a little bit of Sherpa exhaustion syndrome coming through? I mean, isn't it possible to be just a teensy bit more ambitious in terms of what we're pitching for, particularly when it comes to issues of monitoring, verification, accountability, if not the E word, enforcement? I mean, isn't the problem in this area that we've got a lot of national controls now agreed, and they all look pretty good, and the summits have given some real impetus to that. And we've got a lot of global instruments, which are all pretty good on their face in terms of the range of issues they cover, but none of them are much more than hortatory, requiring aspirations rather than actual delivery. And there's practically nothing in the way of accountability mechanisms at the moment, nothing to really ensure that any of this stuff is actually being implemented. Now, I got a little bit of a sense from Pete's contribution that he's conscious of this and wants to move a little bit in the area of operational systems and maybe even on military material issues, which are nice and sensitive. But isn't it the case that we could and should be doing more in this respect, and that this is an area that really lends itself, it's much less inherently controversial than disarmament and non-proliferation and arms control, and yet this area globally is underdone by comparison with the other regimes in terms of the formal mechanisms and instruments that go with it. So can't we just be a little bit more ambitious?
And you, Gary?
Well, Gareth, perhaps you missed it in my presentation, but I was suggesting that this is an area where like-minded countries could be more ambitious. That I think if you got the United States, Australia, Japan, most of the European countries, the ROK, I think we could find a way among ourselves. Well, I think you have to start with like-minded and build it out. I think if you start with an effort, I could easily imagine what an international treaty would look like that would set up the kind of mechanism you and I might like to see. And if you put that down on a piece of paper, I think it would be rejected. It would be completely rejected, and you wouldn't get anywhere. But if you start with a group of like-minded countries who are willing to share enough information that are confident enough to share enough information to give confidence to each other, to cooperate on practical security measures, to show that it works, then you might be able to expand beyond the countries that have very good security practices to others that would benefit from joining that club. To me, that's the only way to proceed. If you try to start with a new treaty negotiation, it'll absolutely go nowhere. Yeah. Anyway.
Pete?
talking to Gareth for 1 minute is enough to eliminate any sign of Sherpa fatigue. I agree that we need to be ambitious, and I think we are ambitious if we get this amended convention into force. I think that's a solid legal basis for nuclear security norms. As I said, not only for nuclear material and transport, but also during use and storage. And if you combine that with that dimension of assurances and peer reviews, where the IEA has the lead, but also other institutions like WINS, where you can share experiences based on these global norms, so that you can verify, not in a, I don't think, especially not that the NSS would be any forum to set up verification or monitoring mechanism. That would be absolutely wrong. But the IEA can play such a role and can ensure that that lessons are learned and experiences shared, and that protection and security systems come at a higher level.
Thank you, and thank you for the injection of ambition as a question here. Yeah, sure, I know.
Reading the, Peter Hayes, Nautilus Institute, reading the talking points and listening to you today, I get the sense that there's not a lot of enthusiasm from any of the Sherpas, or indeed the chair, for the idea that was floated, or will be floated after this session, in part to have a general convention that ties together all the different elements, tries to deal with some of the partial coverage, the uneven coverage, etc., in the different treaties, the different definitions of material, etc. And I share that view myself. But it is, after all, a nuclear security, not just a nuclear materials and facilities theme, that we're meant to be controlling the non-state actors in particular. And one of the areas that is perhaps least covered is the non-state actors that potentially are abusing dual-use technology. For example, centrifuges would not be covered in any of the treaties that would be directly addressed by the Security Summit. Of course, this is the business of states and domestic legislation. It's the business under the 1540 UN Security Council resolution, but that did not actually make it an international legal issue. It required states to set up domestic legislation, but it didn't make it an international crime to engage in smuggling of WMD-related dual-use technology. And so my question is there a particular gap here that could be filled by a convention on nuclear smuggling that solely is focused on that issue, which is a yawning gap in the existing conventions, and that could simply say that any non-state actor that exports without a national license that is approved under domestic legislation is an international crime, which would then facilitate extradition treaties and implementation, compliance, etc., under the different policing arrangements, Interpol, etc. It seems to me it's a huge gap that specifically relates to many of the countries that do not have nuclear facilities or materials, but are the transshipment sites, in some cases have been the source countries of some of the most egregious violations of the non-proliferation regime, say Malaysia during the AQ Khan period, for example. Now that has been slightly fixed by the Malaysians implementing national legislation, but that was after the fact, and we have many other countries that could be problematic in that regard. That's a question.
I think maybe I could answer, because I am actually rather enthusiastic about the idea of trying to strengthen the system by way of a convention in the long term. It's not something which can be done right away and not just after The Hague, but to start thinking about it, filling gaps, and there are lots of gaps, and this might be included in a nuclear security convention if one was to to come to life, but it's rather the way you describe it. I think it's rather a kind of anti-terrorism convention model where you make it an international crime. And there's a certain tradition that this is kept in the basket of anti-terrorism conventions. But certainly it is a problem.
Can I add? The convention that you want to make it a crime to give nuclear material or even radioactive material to non-state actors that have nothing to do with them, that convention exists.
Which doesn't have that technology, and whether you stop the material or the related WMD-specific technology doesn't really matter. You've got to break the chain at one or both places. And at the moment, there are many materials and technologies that are not controlled by any of the treaties that are being under discussion, particularly dual use, and it is not an international crime for those materials to be transferred, proliferated. There are angles, particularly from the UN Security Council resolution on terrorism, where you could try and capture it up the supply chain, but that's legally very ambiguous.
Thank you.
Do you think 1540 covers those dual-use commodities?
No, it does not. It specifically does not, and it was actually formulated so that it wouldn't. It was specifically formulated so it would become a domestic legal responsibility. Right. It's not does not internationalize as a crime in its own right. Nuclear or WMD-related smuggling by non-state actors.
Thank you. I think we should have a couple of questions more. Time is running. Alfredo, next.
Thank you. It is very good to see four good friends seated there. Ambassador Kim tackled with the difficult problem of the opposition, particularly coming from a very large group of states, the non-aligned movement, which is in fact the largest group in the United Nations fora. And we are members. I am from Chile. We are members of the non-aligned, but at the same time, we operated as good friends of the Nuclear Security Summit process since the beginning. And since the beginning, we had very intensive fights within the non-aligned to oppose measures to put into question the legitimacy, the political legitimacy of the summit. But the problem exists because of the non-inclusive nature of this exercise. Now, being a political exercise, it is in the political market, and it is subject to political criticism and evaluation. And Ambassador Kim was advocating for some form, if I understood well, of reaching out to those countries, trying to establish certain contacts, a certain kind of working devices with these countries. I remember very well that in the first summit, Vice President Biden hosted a luncheon where he invited the 14 heads of the delegations of the non-aligned that attended their first summit. That was very interesting, and as a political gesture, I believe it was very effective. But then you tell us that it was simply not possible to agree on a single sentence dealing with nuclear disarmament. And as you know very well, the reference or the continued reference to nuclear disarmament in the context of the three pillars of the NPT is one of the main political priorities of the non-aligned. Why is it not possible to reach an adequate level of political flexibility to include one sentence in a political document? I mean, one sentence is not going to produce anything more than Article 6 or anything more than the final documents of the review conferences of the NPT. Why is it not possible to start being flexible there?
Well, keep in mind that the Nuclear Security Summit is unique because it's the only nuclear venue that includes non-NPT parties. And every effort that Bong Hyun and I made to try to incorporate or build a formulation around the NPT was strenuously objected to by the three non-NPT parties who said, we don't accept the NPT. We will not agree to any formulation that is drawn from the NPT.
But there is one sentence in the Seoul communique. We share the common objective of non-proliferation and nuclear disarmament. Probably you have to be more be satisfied with those one sentence, even though it is one sentence. But
Pete will give us the last words about how to solve this problem.
No, I see the difficulties that my friends wrestled with, but what, for God's sake, is the added value of such a one sentence that has been repeated in a number of other fora times and again? I mean, the NSS should focus on practical measures, and it's true that nuclear security is related to non-proliferation, to nuclear energy, to a whole host of other things. But we should stick to our own guns and not spend too much time to important issues, but are peripheral from the perspective of nuclear security.
Thank you. And I think to be punctual, we have to stop now by thanking our panelists. I'm sorry that we didn't have time for the 2-3 more questions which had been asked. And good luck to all of us in The Hague.
Thank you.
Thank you.
This concludes our second plenary session. Before we proceed to the gala dinner, the Asan Institute would like to take this opportunity to celebrate the launch of the Asan Report titled 2012 Seoul Nuclear Security Summit, a Review, as well as 2 reports by the Nuclear Security Governance Experts Group, also known as the NSGEG. To give us a brief presentation of these reports, I would like to invite to the stage Dr. Shin Chang-hun, the Director of the Asan Nuclear Policy and Technology Center. Please give him a big round of applause.
Thank you very much, distinguished guests and audience. I would like to pay special thanks to Dr. Seymour, Ambassador Kim, and Ambassador de Klerk, the 3 Sherpas for the Washington, the Seoul, and the upcoming Hague Nuclear Security Summit. Yes, please have a seat. I'm sorry. And thankfully, we had the opportunity to hear the views of the representatives from the Troika on our global concerns over nuclear terrorism. Ladies and gentlemen, as you already noticed from the opening video this morning, the Asan Institute for Policy Studies is almost 5 years old, and the Asan Nuclear Policy and Technology Center, which has planned the agenda and the program for this forum, is only 8 months old because it was established on June 4th, 2012 within the Asan Institute. As you know, on March 26th and 27th, the Republic of Korea hosted the Seoul Nuclear Security Summit. 53 heads of states and international organizations attended the summit. On the following week, the Asan Institute invited the Korean nuclear policy experts and nuclear technology experts who have contributed the success of the Seoul Nuclear Security Summit to conduct a follow-up assessment and to discuss the summit's achievements and future assignments. During the meeting, there were heated and enthusiastic discussions. At the end of the meeting, all participants agreed that communications needs to be sustained between nuclear policy experts and nuclear technology experts even after the summit. Taking this suggestion positively and seriously, Dr. Ham Jae-bong, the president of the ASEAN Institute, decided to establish the ASEAN Nuclear Policy and Technology Center within the ASEAN Institute. The 8-month-old center would like to celebrate, as first publications, I mean the 2 sets of publications taking this opportunity. The cover pages of the reports are on the panels to my left and right. The first publications, titled as 2012 Seoul Nuclear Security Summit, a review, is 100-page conference report. The report is available on the desk for complimentary copies. Yes, fortunately, it's complimentary copies at the hall outside of this room. And the other publications are the 2 reports written by the members of the Nuclear Security Governance Experts Group, whose acronym is NSGEG. The group was established jointly by the ASEAN Institute for Policy Studies, Partnership for Global Security, and the Stanley Foundation. The group hosted its first workshop in Seoul in August, and hosted second workshop in London in September, and hosted third workshop in Amman in Jordan. The NSGEG has released 2 reports so far, one titled as Improving Nuclear Security Regime Cohesion, and the other titled Promoting Greater Transparency for Effective Nuclear Security. The final report, as a result of the Jordan workshop, will be published at the end of this February, I think. The 2 reports written in English are already put in your forum packet. They contain summary reports written based upon discussions at the 2 workshops held in Seoul and London, and also suggests policy recommendations for the 2014 Hague Nuclear Security Summit. I hope you keep paying great attention to our upcoming publications, such as Nuclear Power in the Republic of Korea. If you have any questions on the reports or the upcoming publications, I want to take 2 or 3 questions. Thank you very much for your attention. Yes.
Are the papers that are cited and listed in the governance report available, please? They look very interesting.
Yes, it's already in your forum packet.
No, the summary is, but it says at the back there are about 20 different papers by the individual authors.
Yes, right.
And I wondered if they are available somewhere.
Okay, I see. Yes. Yes, I want to let you know the website. It is www.nsgeg.com. Yes. And if you access the website, there are over almost 20 commissioned papers as well. Okay, yes. Thank you very much.